Welcome to the debate. Picture, if you will, the seductive imagery we are all sold of the modern smart city. You walk into a conference and there are these massive screens showing glossy dashboards. They are monitoring everything from traffic flow to water quality, creating this hum of efficiency. You have artificial intelligence layering over public safety systems, optimizing energy use in real time. It looks like the future. It feels like progress.
It certainly sells well in a press release. It is the visual language of, getting things done. It is very shiny.
It is incredibly shiny. But beneath those glowing interfaces and the promise of a seamless urban utopia, there is a critical, often overlooked question lurking in the dark. Who actually owns that data? And perhaps more importantly, who controls the future of that data?
Right. And that is exactly where the dream often meets the cold, hard reality of procurement contracts, budget cycles, and the very limited technical talent available to local government.
Exactly. Today, we are debating the tension between the immense pressure for quick wins in local government digitization versus the long-term strategic risks of proprietary ecosystems and vendor lock-in.
It is the classic battle between getting it done now, because the mayor wants a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and getting it done right for a future that is, frankly, 10 years away.
I will be taking the position that while architectural ideals are noble, the technical burden of open integration creates a paralyzing barrier for smaller local councils. When you lack resources, lack staff, and need results, turnkey solutions are not a trap. They are a pragmatic, perhaps necessary evil. And I will be arguing that strict architectural governance, open APIs, and data sovereignty must be the non-negotiable foundation of any smart city project, regardless of the immediate hurdles.
Okay.
So for my position statement, I want to start with a concept from our material that I find incredibly compelling: the illusion of progress. We see councils falling for this repeatedly. They buy hardware bundled with proprietary platforms because the dashboards light up immediately. It looks like they have achieved something massive. But I would argue that failing to read the fine print on these contracts is not just a technical oversight. It is a catastrophic long-term strategic risk. Without an API-first mandate, cities end up with isolated digital silos rather than a unified digital nervous system. If you do not own the architecture, you do not own the city. You're just a tenant in your own infrastructure.
Well, catastrophic is a heavy word. For my position, I think we need to ground this in the reality of the people actually making these decisions. We are not talking about Singapore or London or New York here. Cities with massive budgets and dedicated digital transformation units. We are talking about mid-sized municipalities. Towns of 50 or 100,000 people. They have lean IT teams, often just a handful of generalists who are busy keeping the email servers running and the printers working. Vendors arrive with turnkey packages. These come with attractive financing, sometimes zero upfront cost, and promises of seamless integration, but only within that vendor's specific ecosystem, of course. If I am a council leader and I can deploy smart parking, get the media coverage, and show the public a win now versus spending 18 months building a smart cities open integration platform from scratch, I am taking the turnkey solution. If we wait for architectural perfection, we never modernize at all.
Let us get into that, because I think the scarcity of resources you just mentioned is exactly why they cannot afford to make a mistake that costs millions to fix later. Being poor is expensive if you buy the wrong things.
But look at the pressure they are under. The citizens want the potholes fixed and the parking to work. They do not care about the API architecture.
They might not care about the architecture today, but they will care about the bill tomorrow. This is what the material refers to as the migration track.
Explain that in this context.
Well, when a council manages only a handful of projects, say 5 to 10, those proprietary dashboards work fine. They are isolated, sure, but manageable. A dashboard for parking, a dashboard for waste. But the material points out that smart cities do not stay small. Projects scale. You get lighting, then waste management, then air quality, then traffic counting.
Success breeds expansion. That is the goal, is it not?
Exactly. But if you bought a turnkey solution for lighting from vendor A and a turnkey solution for waste from vendor B, and a turnkey parking solution from vendor C, and none of them share data standards, you are building those digital silos I mentioned. You end up with a patchwork that is completely unmanageable. You are paying for different support contracts, managing different cybersecurity.
Faster from an enterprise architecture perspective.
The realization comes too late. To fix it, or to make these systems talk to each other, you essentially have to rip and replace. The migration costs are high, integration is complex, and the council's bargaining power shrinks to absolute zero because you are locked in.
I come at it from a different way, though. You say bargaining power shrinks, but initially, the council has no bargaining power if they cannot even get the project off the ground. You have to consider the FOMO factor, the fear of missing out. Councils watch neighboring towns leap ahead with these shiny new systems.
But are they leaping ahead? Or are they just running faster into a dead end? Vendor lock-in is not just an annoyance. The material explicitly states it creates structural constraints. Let us look at a concrete example from the text. Traffic systems influencing emergency response.
Okay.
If your traffic data is locked in vendor A's cloud and your emergency dispatch is on vendor B's system and they do not speak the same language, you literally cannot optimize ambulance routing based on real-time traffic data. You have capped your city's intelligence. You might have saved 6 months on the install, but you are losing efficiency and potentially lives on the operation because the systems are deaf to each other.
That is a compelling argument. I will grant you that the cross-domain integration is where the real value lies, but have you considered the technical bar for entry required to avoid that trap? The material lists the requirements for a sustainable architecture. It is an absolute alphabet soup of standards.
It is the necessary language of the Internet of Things.
It is daunting. REST and open APIs? Sure, most people grasp that. But then we are talking about multi-protocol IoT support, MQTT, AMQP, OPC-UA. We are talking about real-time data processing and, quote, data normalization with common city data models.
Yes, these are the fundamental standards.
But think about the personnel. To implement this, the material suggests you essentially need to create a cross-domain data committee. You need internal staff who understand how to normalize data from a parking sensor and a waste bin into a common JSON format or similar model. Many councils simply do not have that capability. They're struggling to find people who can manage basic local area networks.
That is an interesting point, though. I would frame it entirely differently. You are arguing that because it is hard, we should not do it. But the lack of internal capability is exactly why they need open standards.
How does making it more complex help a team with no skills?
Because if you buy a proprietary black box solution, you are entirely dependent on that vendor's technicians forever. Only they can fix it. Only they can update it. If you insist on open standards like MQTT and REST, you open up the market. You can hire a wider range of developers. You can outsource the maintenance to a local software firm. You can switch vendors to someone who is more affordable or responsive. Proprietary code is a prison. Open standards are a marketplace.
A marketplace requires an informed buyer, though. My fear is that by mandating these complex standards, we force councils into a different kind of dependency, a dependency on high-priced consultants who are the only ones who understand how to weave these open standards together into a working platform. A turnkey vendor at least offers a single throat to choke when things go wrong.
Does that vendor actually solve the structural problems, or do they just hide them behind a nice interface? Reframe it. Without this rigor, as the text says, modernization slows down and third-party innovation is discouraged.
Discouraged how?
If you want local startups to build apps using city data, telling citizens where the parking spots are or which parks are quiet, you need open APIs. If the data is locked inside a vendor's app, that local innovation cannot happen. If you want to swap out an old sensor for a better, cheaper one next year, you need multi-protocol support. If you do not have that, you are stuck paying whatever your original vendor wants to charge you for the upgrade.
I suppose I am just skeptical that a cross-domain data committee is realistic for a town of 50,000 people. It sounds like a lot of bureaucracy that will just stall projects.
It does not have to be a committee of 20 people sitting in a boardroom. It can be a clause in a contract. The material suggests practical steps, mandate data ownership clauses, require open APIs. You do not need to be a software engineer to put that requirement in a request for proposal.
Fair enough. Writing it in a contract is one thing, enforcing it is another. But let us pivot to something that usually scares councils even more than technical standards: security.
A crucial topic.
Often decision makers perceive these governance frameworks, these strict requirements you are advocating for, as bureaucracy. They see it as red tape that slows down deployment. They think, why do we need a 6-month security audit for a park bench sensor? Just install the thing and let us gather the data.
And I completely disagree with that mindset. Governance is not bureaucracy, it is insurance.
How so? When you force a vendor to jump through 10 hoops of governance before they can install a CCTV camera, that absolutely slows down innovation.
Consider the alternative. The material highlights a terrifying reality. Connecting more edge devices increases the attack surface of the entire city. Every smart sensor is a potential entry point for a cyber attack. If those sensors are proprietary black boxes where encryption and access controls are not transparent to the council, you have no idea if they are actually secure.
So you are saying the proprietary nature itself is a security risk. Usually vendors argue the opposite. They claim their walled garden is more secure than an open system precisely because they control everything end-to-end.
That is security by obscurity, and it has been debunked for decades in the cybersecurity world. If encryption and access controls are not transparent, security risks multiply exponentially. You cannot audit what you cannot see.
I just do not buy that open is always inherently more secure. Sometimes having a tailored, closed loop is safer than exposing a documented API to the public internet where anyone can probe it.
But the closed loop is still connected to your municipal network. And if that vendor goes out of business or decides to stop patching that specific hardware model, you are left with thousands of insecure endpoints scattered across the city that you cannot fix. Clear governance actually speeds up vendor onboarding eventually because you have set the rules of the road. You reduce legal disputes later because you define data ownership and security standards up front.
I can see that point about long-term patching. If you do not know who owns the data or how the device is secured under the hood, you are effectively paralyzed when a breach happens or when support ends.
Exactly. When governance is unclear, the ability to respond to threats is compromised. Local councils cannot afford to treat data governance as an afterthought. It has to be baked into the architecture from day one.
I will concede that the security argument is probably the strongest lever you have. No mayor wants to be the one explaining to the press why the city's traffic lights were hacked because they bought a cheap, unauditable system. But there is another dimension here that the material touches on, which is the value of the data itself.
This is where I think the disconnect is strongest between the now mindset you are describing and the future mindset.
You are talking about data as a strategic asset versus an operational byproduct.
Yes. The material argues forcefully that data is not just for operations. It is not just about knowing if a bin is full so a truck can be dispatched to pick it up. Data informs urban policy. It influences long-term investment. And crucially, it drives AI capabilities.
Sure. In theory.
No, in practice. In an era where artificial intelligence relies entirely on high-quality, comprehensive datasets, data sovereignty becomes directly tied to competitive advantage. If a council cannot export its data in standard formats without paying massive penalties to a vendor, they cannot use future AI tools. They are locking themselves out of the next major technological revolution.
But let us get real for a second. Are these councils ready to monetize city data? Are they ready to act as platform operators? That seems like a massive stretch for the mid-sized councils we are discussing. They are just trying to pick up the trash on time and keep the streetlights on. Telling them they need to protect their data sovereignty for future AI monetization sounds a bit like science fiction to them. They are dealing with clogged drains, not training large language models.
It isn't science fiction. It is what the material frames around the 2030 perspective.
The 2030 question.
Yes. Looking ahead to 2030, smart cities will be shaped by digital twins and cross-domain orchestration.
A digital twin is a virtual replica of the city used for simulation to test traffic flows or urban planning or disaster response before it happens in the real world. These technologies require absolute interoperability. If you build a closed ecosystem today, a digital twin is mathematically impossible tomorrow.
Impossible?
Practically, yes. You cannot model your city if half your data is locked in a vendor's vault and the other half is in a proprietary format that your modeling software cannot even read.
So your argument is that by taking the easy road now, the turnkey road, they are essentially canceling their ability to participate in the future of urban management?
Precisely. If the foundation is weak, future capabilities become constrained. The decisions made today define how adaptable a city can be tomorrow. A city that owns its data can change its mind. A city that does not own its data is just a customer.
That is a compelling vision, I will give you that. But I keep going back to the human element, the FOMO factor. The material mentions that cities that establish open integration frameworks will onboard new vendors without friction and negotiate from strength. But that gap is not visible in year one.
No, it is not visible immediately.
In year one, the city that bought the turnkey solution has a shiny app on the mayor's phone. The city that insisted on open APIs is still writing the RFP and arguing with consultants about MQTT protocols. The mayor of the turnkey city looks like a genius to the voters. The mayor of the open city looks like they're stalling.
But by year 5?
Well, by year 5, the turnkey city is drowning in subscription fees and integration costs while the open city is scaling seamlessly. I get it. The logic holds up perfectly. But political cycles are short. Year 5 is often someone else's problem.
That is the exact cynicism that leads to bad infrastructure. We do not build physical bridges that fall down in 5 years just because it is cheaper and faster for the current administration. Why do we accept building digital infrastructure that fails in 5 years?
Because a physical bridge falling down is highly visible. A failing API integration is just a line item in the IT budget that nobody reads. But let us look at the solutions offered, because we cannot just admire the problem here. The material suggests council should think beyond the pilot. Always ask, can this scale across the entire city without creating a new silo?
And conduct vendor lock-in risk assessments. Evaluate every proposal against long-term migration risk. That is something any council can do today. It does not require a PhD in computer science to ask a very simple question during procurement. If we want to leave you in 3 years, how do we get our data out and how much will it cost us?
That is a highly practical question. And the material also mentions enforcing data portability. Demand clear mechanisms for exporting data. I think that is a solid middle ground. You can buy the turnkey solution to get the quick win, but the contract must ensure you can walk away with your historical data in a standard format like CSV or JSON, not some proprietary encrypted blob that is useless to anyone else.
That is a start, but often, even if you get the data out, if the physical devices are proprietary, you have to rip and replace the hardware anyway. That is why multi-protocol support is on that list of non-negotiables. You need devices that speak standard languages. If you buy a smart streetlight that only speaks vendor A's proprietary language and you fire vendor A, you have a dark street. If you buy a streetlight that speaks OPC UA or MQTT natively, you just point it to a new server.
That is where the alphabet soup comes back to haunt us, but I suppose if you frame it as hardware independence, it sells a lot better to the finance department. We can change our software provider without buying 10,000 new lampposts. That is a sentence a CFO actually understands.
Exactly. It is entirely about bargaining power. The cities that get this right will negotiate from a position of strength. Switching vendors becomes a realistic threat, so vendors have to compete on price and innovation rather than just holding you hostage because the switching costs are too high.
I have to admit the point about bargaining power resonates strongly. Even a small, under-resourced council understands leverage. If you have none, you are going to be exploited by the market.
The gap between cities that get this right and those that do not will not be visible immediately, but as the source material says, it will be painfully obvious by year 5. We are seeing the split happen right now in the real world. Some cities are nimble, adding AI and new sensors easily. Others are stuck paying out 10-year contracts for obsolete technology.
So, where do we leave this debate?
I think the conclusion is stark. Local councils must mandate data ownership clauses and think beyond the pilot phase. They have to stop viewing the fine print as a nuisance and start viewing it as their primary strategic tool. The quote-unquote boring work of governance is actually the most exciting work of city building because it enables everything else that comes after.
And I will concede that data portability and open APIs are critical for the long-term health of any municipality. However, I still maintain that the path to get there requires a massive shift in mindset. We are asking local councils to value architectural foresight over the fear of missing out on the latest gadgets. That is a heavy cultural lift. It requires leaders who are willing to look boring today in order to be smart tomorrow.
It is a heavy lift, but smart cities are not built by installing devices. They are built by designing adaptable systems.
And perhaps the listener needs to look at their own local leaders and ask, are we building a foundation or are we just buying shiny hardware to put on a brochure?
That is the ultimate question. The fear of missing out should not be about deploying the latest gadget. It should be about missing the opportunity to build the right foundation for the decades to come.
Well said.
That is all for today. Welcome to the debate.